This film tells the story of a black slave named Django who struggles desperately to find his wife, who is also shackled by slavery. In the middle of his journey, he is made a partner by a fugitive hunter who gradually Django becomes a skilled shooter. One day, Django and his partner discover the fact that his wife is in a criminal's den as a slave of a very influential, wealthy, and cruel person, which finally makes Django have to think hard to save his wife, and the film begins. This story takes place in 1858, a time when racial discrimination and slavery were still prevalent in America. At that time, slaves purchased from an auction in Greenville were traveling with slave traders nicknamed the Speck Brothers. That night, they were approached by a dentist named King, and King's intention was to find one of the slaves who had worked on the Carrican plantation, named Django. King was looking for Django for a reason, but rather to find the whereabouts of the Brittle brothers, hoping for Django's help. Because Django knew their faces, King finally decided to buy Django, but the Speck brothers had no intention of selling him, and a conflict ensued. King eventually killed one of the Speck brothers and took Django away, while the other was left to be tortured by the slaves there. The next day they stopped in a town, and it was seen that Django was treated well as if he were not a slave. Even now, Django was able to enter the bar, which made the bar owner run in fear while saying he would call the sheriff because slaves were not allowed to enter bars. Here King explains to Django that he is a fugitive hunter and will bring in fugitives for payment from the authorities. King then offers Django a deal to help and go with him to a plantation where he has information that the Brittle brothers are located. Django simply had to show them their faces, and King would kill them. If successful, Django would be freed from slavery and receive a reward of $25 for each head. Without further ado, Django immediately agreed to the deal. Shortly afterward, the sheriff arrived and ordered King and Django to leave, but King shot the sheriff without further ado. In the midst of panic, the bar owner ran back to report to the marshal, the sheriff's superior. Then the marshal and his men came to the two of them and immediately surrounded the place. However, King calmly explained to the marshal that the sheriff he had killed earlier was actually a fugitive wanted for stealing cattle in Texas. And this statement was also supported by an official letter he received from the state judge. After hearing this explanation, the marshal and all his men could only remain silent. In short, they continued their journey, and while resting, King asked Django what he would do after he was free and received his money. Django replied that he would look for his wife Brumhilde von Schaft and buy her freedom. King was surprised to hear the German name attached to Django's wife because King was also of German descent. Django then explained that he and Hilda were owned by different masters. Hilda was owned by a master of German descent, which is why she had a German name and spoke German. While at the Carrican plantation, they tried to escape but were caught by the Brittle brothers and sold to slave traders, which is how Django and Hilda were separated. They arrive at Mr. Bennett's house and Django is seen pretending to be King's servant. King then confirms that Django is his servant and a free man, and afterward he explains the purpose of his visit is to buy a female slave with a tempting price for Mr. Bennett. And finally, Django is allowed to explore the plantation while looking for the Brittle brothers. The slave woman accompanying Django then pointed out one of the plantation overseers who had the same characteristics as he had described. Django remembered them well because they were the ones who had captured and tortured him and his wife when they tried to escape. After that, Django asked again where the other two Brittle brothers were, and the woman said that the other two were in the pen, punishing a slave who had done something wrong. Django quickly went to where they were, and when he got there, he immediately called one of them over and shot him. Not only that, Django whipped another man just like they had whipped his wife, and of course killed him. King also arrived shortly thereafter, and after confirming the whereabouts of the last man, he shot the Brittle brothers from a distance who were riding horses on the plantation. Because of the murder they committed, Bennett was angry and approached them with full weapons. But as usual, King explained that he and Django were legal representatives ordered by an American court judge to arrest the Brittle brothers. They were all wanted for murder, and King explained that he had a warrant in the name of the law and threatened that if Bennett resisted or obstructed their duties, the risk would be hanged. In the end, after they told everything, Bennett finally let them go. That night, Bennett and his men, displeased with the murders committed by King and Django, intended to retaliate by planning to kill them by surrounding the horse-drawn carriage. Unfortunately, Bennett's intentions were already predicted by King, so to prevent this, King planted explosives on the horse-drawn carriage beforehand and hid in the forest. As Bennett and his men surrounded them, the explosives detonated, killing some of Bennett's men and seriously injuring the rest. King then gave his rifle to Django, allowing him to try shooting Bennett from a distance. Django managed to kill him, and it was here that King saw Django's shooting talent. After Django successfully killed the Brittle brothers, Django is now a free man, and now he plans to go to the slave auction to find his wife. Initially, King tried to forbid him because he thought this mission was too dangerous for Django. But soon King changed his mind because he began to be attracted to Django's persistence, who had a great responsibility to save his wife. Moreover, now King also thought he was obliged to help as a fellow German to free Broomhilda. King then invited Django as his partner as a fugitive hunter during the winter, and would help find Django's wife when the winter ended. Finally, their collaboration began as partners in hunting criminals, while training Django in between his hunts until he became skilled at shooting and became a skilled fugitive hunter. In short, winter ended, and they arrived at a town called Greenville, which was a slave auction center. Here every slave purchased was registered along with the name of the person who bought them, and they finally discovered that the person who bought Broomhilda was Calvin Candy. Calvin was a wealthy man in Mississippi and the owner of Candyland, the largest cotton plantation. He also ran a Mandingo fighting business, which involved fights between black slaves until one of them died. Because it won't be easy to free Broomhilda, King finally has a plan where he will pretend to like the Mandingo business and intends to buy one of Calvin's Mandingo fighters at a high price, while buying Broomhilda at a low price as a bonus. And to look more convincing, of course, Django has to pretend to be an expert Mandingo fighter. Finally, King and Django approach Calvin, who was betting on a Mandingo fight. There, King introduced Django as his fighter and expressed his intention to buy one of Calvin's best fighters, but Calvin had no intention of selling his fighters. Finally, King made an irresistible offer at an unreasonable price that greatly interested Calvin. The next day, they are invited to Candyland and visit Calvin's mansion. The mansion is inhabited by Calvin's loyal servant Stephen, who is also black, but Stephen is very condescending towards his fellow blacks, including Django. Without wasting any time, King then carried out his plan, saying that he wanted to be entertained at night with a black girl who could speak German. Calvin then ordered Stephen to prepare Broomhilda, but how shocked Django was after learning that Broomhilda was being punished for trying to escape. Broomhilda was punished by being put in an iron cage placed on the ground and exposed to direct sunlight so that she was slowly tortured by the heat. In the evening before dinner, Broomhilda was ordered to meet and accompany King in his room. King was seen treating Broomhilda very well, giving her drinks and inviting her to chat. King also explained that he and his friend had gone through various obstacles and traveled thousands of miles just to find Broomhilda. He continued his explanation that his and his friend's intention was to take Broomhilda away from here forever. However, hearing that Broomhilda did not understand, and King, who did not want to explain who his friend was, only invited Django, who was hiding behind the door, to go directly to Broomhilda and explain it. King then asked Broomhilda not to scream when she saw the person in question, and when Django revealed himself by calling his wife's nickname, the Troublemaker, Broomhilda was so shocked that she fainted. The story continues at dinner. Broomhilda, who is also present to serve them, pretends not to recognize Django as her husband, obviously to ensure their plan goes smoothly. King and Calvin continue their business discussion about purchasing fighters, and King asks for a 5-day payment extension. However, King intends to buy Broomhilda immediately as a down payment. Meanwhile, Stephen saw Broomhilda's behavior was very strange because she always paid attention to Django, and he, who was not so sure, then tried to confirm by interrogating Broomhilda, but Broomhilda tried to cover it up. Stephen, who continued to pay attention to Broomhilda and Django's behavior at the dinner table, finally came to a conclusion and was sure that Broomhilda and Django actually knew each other. Stephen then invited Calvin to talk to him privately in the back room, and there Stephen told Calvin about his suspicions. Stephen also had the assumption that their real goal was not to buy a fighter, but to buy Broomhilda and run away after getting her. Calvin, who had no doubt about Stephen's loyalty and deeply trusted his words, became furious when he realized that King and Django had intended to deceive him. Calvin's men immediately pointed their guns at the two men, and not only that, Calvin also threatened King to pay immediately according to the agreement, or he would kill Broomhilda. Because King knew Calvin was a very cruel man and would not hesitate to kill Broomhilda, he finally gave in and immediately paid Broomhilda $12,000, which was a very high price compared to the actual price for a slave girl of $300. Insulted by this humiliation, King approached Calvin as if to shake hands. But at that moment, King shot Calvin dead with a small pistol hidden in his hand. Because of this recklessness, King was killed by Calvin's men, and a brutal gunfight ensued between Django and Calvin's men. Django then took a weapon from one of Calvin's slain men and attempted to survive their encirclement. However, the sheer number of enemies forced Django to a corner, running out of ammunition, and he was subsequently threatened to surrender after they had all successfully captured Boomhilda. Django finally surrendered for his wife's sake and was hanged upside down. Initially, Django was to be castrated, but Stephen, on the orders of Calvin's sister, changed the punishment to being returned to slavery and sent to a mine for forced labor. Django's struggle did not end there, and on the way to the mine, he who had learned how to be a fugitive hunter from King tried to incite the guards. He told the guards that he was a fugitive hunter and he had a target with a total reward of $11,500 in Candyland, and he would share the reward if the guards would let him go. After gaining their trust, Django was finally released and given a weapon. Then, without further ado, Django immediately killed them all. After that, Django immediately returned to Candyland on horseback while carrying a bag containing explosives to free his wife and avenge King's death. Upon arrival, Django immediately took Broomhilda's freedom letter from the corpse of his friend King and also prayed for him. After picking up Broomhilda, Django surprised Calvin's men with his cowboy style. Then he killed them one by one, including Calvin's younger sister, and ordered all black people to leave the house except Stephen. With a vengeance, Django shot Stephen in both legs so that he couldn't escape, and then Django lit the explosives he had placed to destroy the house. In the end, Django stood proudly to watch the house collapse with Stephen inside. The film ends with Django achieving his goal of freeing his wife and living in freedom, even though he had to lose his mentor and companion King.